and good evening, everyone. I'm here again, and I'm feeling really privileged this evening because I'm here to introduce the next guest. So I just want to welcome Dr. Kevin Maloney.
Hello, it's nice to meet you virtually.
Hi, Kevin. I know because it's the first time also for us to at least meet, because for real we have never had the opportunity to meet in person for now, I hope. But before introducing you, Kevin, I just want to tell you a little bit of story, because I discovered your research and your work about transmedia storytelling a few years ago, I think around 2010, 2011, where I'm researching for my PhD thesis. So I'm really honored to be here and to talk with you. Before starting, before giving the stage, Dr. Kevin Maloney is an assistant professor of emerging media design and development at Ball State University, and where he teaches and researches, of course, design thinking, transmedia storytelling and project management. But prior to entering the academy, Kevin was a contract photojournalist for the New York Times, and today is here with us to talk about the keyword rigor.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so please.
So, well, I'll start here, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you about this term and this idea, because even though the two of us research and study very much similar things, you're doing it in a design program and my doing it in a journalism program sort of presents different ideas on what rigor might look like and how we approach the design of stories ethically and carefully. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say about this also, Mariana. But okay. I have been thinking about this word rigor recently, thanks to changes in the United States and worldwide because of the pandemic, but also because of our moment with Black Lives Matter and the change in the intensity of perception about police violence on Black people here in the United States. And it raised a lot of questions for me about the idea of rigor. And, you know, I'm a journalist, I'm a designer, and I'm an academic. And in all of these fields, rigor sort of implies a strenuous effort to follow rules, to make sure that you protect the integrity of the data you're gathering and to protect the process. But it also unfolds in different ways in those various spaces. And that idea of stubbornness or of intransigence and inflexibility strikes me often as quite counterintuitive to what our ultimate goal might be. It even sounds a little bit like a corpse, thanks to rigor mortis. So it's a word that's interested me a lot.
Okay, since you also described the term related to the idea of storytelling, so stories and the importance of telling your story, telling our story, but also to me, when it's coming to storytelling, it's also connected to the idea of being able to listen to people, because it's the only way. It's like coming toward the border and trying to listen, and in order to sharing also the knowledge. So what was really interesting to me in your research and in your work is the fact that at least for me, when I started my research, I'm talking about, is the fact that usually storytelling was connected to the idea of the entertainment field. But I started to think to the fact that, okay, but what does it mean when we move the storytelling practice within non-fictional environment? So what does it mean, for example, putting the storytelling practice within the journalism practice? And so what does it mean for journalists to stay strict to rigor and try not to promote false and fake news, but empowering positive ideas, but also letting people the possibility to come back. So I'm also thinking about the field of citizen journalism or participatory journalism. So I'm sorry, I just put a lot of things on the plate as usual. So I stop talking, and again, I just want to ask you, what do you think, and also according to your previous experience.
Well, rigor in journalism is interesting to me because a lot of the ideas of how we think about rigor in journalism transfer to those other spaces that you mentioned, whether it's the empathy research that we use to inform our design. And at my center, we use design thinking, which is, has many names in different fields and disciplines, but it's mostly about, as you say, listening to the stakeholders and the subjects for what they need a product or a story or information to do for them. And with journalism, that hasn't happened for, until only recently, if at all. Before, there was really only a one-way conversation between journalists and the people that they served because there was no mechanism for that question or that information to feedback quickly and responsively. But thinking about rigor in this particular moment really took me back recently to a picture I made almost 30 years ago. And I brought this picture to share. So I'm sure they'll pop it up here shortly. Yes. So this photograph I made in 1990 when I was a very young photojournalist. I got up one Saturday morning, heard a chaos of sirens out in front of my apartment. And it was early in the morning, so I ran out in my bathrobe and my slippers to see what was going on, to find this man being arrested by 6 police officers, tied in an uncomfortable position and thrown into the back of a patrol car with great indignity. And I've been thinking about this in terms of journalistic and storytelling rigor recently, because at the time, as a 25-year-old photojournalist, trained that rigor in journalistic storytelling is to merely present the facts. It was my job then, I perceived, to be rigorous about showing up, understanding the point of view of experts on the scene, so the police officers themselves, and merely documenting what was happening. So I didn't question what I was seeing. The police officers told me that the man was under the influence of drugs. He had been walking down the street, breaking car windows and house windows, and he was being arrested. So I scrambled out, I made the picture, I took it down to the newspaper as soon as I could and got it into the next day's edition, where we reported why the man was arrested and how much damage he'd caused, which wasn't very much. It was probably $400 in 1990 money. And then it stopped. So it was easy as a 25-year-old to sit back and feel like I had completed the rigor of the journalistic task. I had reported honestly and clearly, so my job was done. But now in a moment in the US where we are looking at our dealings at every level with people of different races and cultures and backgrounds. And this is all exaggerated by the current pandemic also, it seems. But I started rethinking this picture and realizing that I had really kind of helped marginalize this man by, excuse me, I had helped marginalize this man by publishing a photograph without really finding out in detail what had happened. And if I think about the picture now, it's likely that he was depressed or angry. He was probably drinking. Maybe he was on drugs. And he had broken a few windows. And if he had been a white man, he probably would have been arrested more politely by one police officer and probably would have had the charges dropped as long as he paid for the windows that he had broken. So there was a big disparity in his treatment, probably. versus what he would have received had he been white. And I had, at the time, used the idea of rigor and the ethics of journalism as a crutch rather than as a mechanism to find something more important. And that is that the police officers were probably suffering from unconscious bias or confirmation bias in how they approached him. And I also was probably suffering from unconscious bias and confirmation bias. When they told me what he had allegedly done, I just believed it. So I've also realized, too, that my ethics and my rigor have evolved as a journalist over the previous decades, that now I think about this in a different way. And I think this gets to what you were discussing earlier about listening to your subjects and listening to the people that you design for. We use empathy to make sure that we are not only trying to find out what other people want or need in a design, but also to prove ourselves wrong. And in journalism, as we have thought about what it means to be objective and what our ethics should do and what rigor means in that profession, it is kind of settling in that direction. And I'm really fascinated with the idea that what we do strives in all fields. When we have rigor, we are striving to overcome our own biases and try to prove ourselves wrong in the research we do. So that's how I link journalism to the fields I'm working in now also, whether it's research or whether it's design itself. And as I've taught design thinking courses at the university, I see this all the time in both myself and my students, where we do a similar thing and we take the idea of process and method. So we use the design thinking method to help get us closer to what the needs of our stakeholders might really be in designing a story or in designing an application or a website or any of the other things that we build. And we kind of have a tendency to use that process as a crutch. So either we stop thinking about it particularly deeply and critically because we have accomplished the rigor, we have done the job of doing the design thinking, so therefore the results must be correct, and we don't go back often enough and think about them critically.
And I really like the fact that, I don't know if you had the opportunity to follow also the previous chat, also because other colleagues of us were talking a lot about the empathy. So the fact that we need to, again, listen to understand. And what I was thinking now is the fact that there are a lot of different scholars that are talking about the importance of narratives for humankind. A lot of them are defining, for example, the human race like Homo fabulans or Homo narrans. So saying the fact that people are storytellers that are guided in their decision by the stories by which they are surrounded. And the fact that so it's not just listening stories, but learning how to telling stories. So I was asking you, since to me it's really important, till now there are a lot of design schools that are teaching students how to design product, services, fashion products, and so on, and communication products. But in your experience, for you, what do you mean to teach young students, young designers, to design stories?
My origins with this come with the idea of transmedia storytelling, which, as you have found, also opens up really interesting avenues for not only telling richer stories, but also for directly addressing and dealing with particular publics in the design and the creation of those things. So I hadn't thought about how a story is designed much until I started studying transmedia storytelling. But there, an act of design is required, right? You You are not only producing individual stories, but multiple stories that have to interact and relate to each other, maybe unfold in a particular order in some cases, and be additive in what they bring to a person. And thinking about that, I settled back on how much, when we're creating any kind of story, whether it's a visual one from my photojournalism career, or it's a verbal one from doing a little bit of radio and writing a lot, that we are designing an arc that moves from point A to point B, and that can be a very manipulative experience. So it's interesting making students aware of how much power a narrative might have over the way someone thinks, the way someone acts. It's Walter Fisher's narrative paradigm as a piece of that puzzle that helps us understand, what the power of this is. And students are, most of them have not thought about that power before. So we engage in really interesting discussions about what stories have moved them in surprising ways. And so that we can engage what some of those qualities might be to help fight fake news, to help bring out better information about pandemics or racial bias and other issues in the world.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you talk about teaching students about not only design and constructing stories, but also deconstructing them. Because to me, in my experience, working with students coming from the Gen Z, the problem sometimes is the fact that they are really smart, that are using a lot of different devices. They are always on, but at the same time, they need a sort of, roadmap in order to understanding sometimes the real meaning of, for example, a picture like the one that you show us. Also because, as you were saying, it's not just a matter of written story, but especially within social media, sometimes the problem is connected to the visual storytelling, because it's really, really powerful. And that's led me to asking you another things, because in the previous chat, Nick Barton talked about the generative power of language. And that's led me to think about, the stories are made by different languages. So what do you think about the generative power of stories? So
yes, tell me a little bit more about how he defined generative power in terms of story. I'm curious.
They were talking about the generative power of language, but usually it's something that I use when I teach to students, to talk about the generative power of stories, because to me, and again, I just like to connect with your idea of the possibility to have multiple stories. Nowadays, it's not just the fact of having different stories, but to me, another important practice is the story making and the word making activity, because it's the only way to create a collaborative space in which you can establish and create some common rules, like to say, let people coming in and let them create with you a possible story word. And I just want to connect. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. It's your talk. It's not mine.
I think this is fantastic.
I'm so excited to talk about storytelling that just stop me. It's the last thing. No, the fact that Silvia Gramegna before was talking about the role of a designer, saying that the designer is not just a problem solver or a mediator, but also, according to the idea of Ezio Manzini, it's a sense maker. And to me, being a sense maker means leading with storytelling, word making, and story creation. So I don't know, what do you think?
A design field that interests me very much, and I have never had my hands in it, but I have a brother who is, and that's architecture. And I like the idea of architecture because of the way that you conceive of it as making a space for stories to happen. And I think when we are designing transmedia stories in particular, as you say, when we are assisting in the building of worlds where many people come together to tell different pieces of a story that combine to create something, we're doing exactly what an architect does, and that is building a space that allows for those stories to come in and for different perspectives and voices to be heard. So one of the limiting factors, I think, of a single story, of a very simple story, is that it is only one point of view, and it's very brief, even though it has a lot of power. So, for example, in the photograph I showed, I like to think a lot about how still images become stories, even though there is no anything moving in them as the way there is in video. You don't get from a point A to a point B as you do in a video story, or have the context that is brought to you by a story in words. So what happens with a photograph is that each picture ends up being one point on a story arc or a hero's journey or any other structure we might want to apply to the storytelling there. And in the picture I showed, it's probably the climax of the story. It's the moment of the arrest where the characters in the story come into collision. But since it is only one point on that narrative arc, then the readers of that photograph end up inventing in their own minds what those other stages of that story arc might be, from the launch of the story with the rising action through the coming into conflict and the falling action and the denouement. You invent all of these stories for yourselves. And making stories more complex allows for those other pieces to be assembled a little bit better. And in the end, I think it is a more ethical structure in terms of creating stories that better communicate and better serve. For the designer of a still picture, for example, I used to tell my photojournalism students fairly rigorously and aggressively that you have to imagine what people are going to apply to the rest of that photograph so that you can try to offset it, or you can try and mitigate the damage of someone else's imagination in terms of what happens in this story. And the picture I showed is not a stellar example of that, because different people will create an entirely different story out of that moment than others. So yes, I agree. Stories are incredibly generative.
Yeah, and also I was thinking, talking about the bias that you can create in showing just one shot, a picture. This was leading me to think about okay, I don't want to go political, but just what happens in the last days about the news about the fact that TikTokers were able to make a disaster of the first live appearance of Trump. So I was thinking, for example, about the total amount of articles that are online that are telling completely different stories, showing, the same space, but from different point of view. So just to coming back to the idea that how do you think it will be possible to let people learn how to understand this kind of images? So do you think it will be enough to teach them how to create stories? Because if you teach them how to create a story, you are teaching them at the same time how to reading the stories. Or do you think we need to find new methodologies to do that?
Well, I think teaching people to tell stories as a method of reading stories is a very interesting one. I don't know that it's exclusively the answer, because when you teach someone to tell a story, they may end up using that power for evil as much as they use that power for good. So there's a lot of discussion in journalism and in the socially concerned stories that we design in the center where I work, because what you want to do is make sure that everything you're creating is very transparent. So someone sees what your point of view is, how you are situated with that story, so that they can understand where you are coming from. And then I think it's also important to be very transparent in the stories that others create, to really show that you have struggled to prove yourself wrong first, rather than having worked to prove yourself right with a prior perception. All of this is very fraught. All of this is very new, and it's a very, it's a developing sort of ethos, right? Because for 200-300 years, we had one-way stories, and we liked it or we didn't, and there wasn't anything we could do about it. So it's a new landscape. It's a new environment to have so many different stories from a single event coming in from so many multiple perspectives that you have to become very digitally savvy to understand where you sit among those stories. And I think it is a responsibility of story designers or curators and developers to assist with the problem of understanding the information at hand.
Okay, just the last question before leaving the stage to the next host. Do you think that the transmedia storytelling practice or the world building practice can leverage the social function of the stories, in your opinion?
Not always. I think some stories are going to natively work that way and want to become very complex and interesting transmedia stories. And I'm thinking of a purposefully designed transmedia story here. Other stories don't lend themselves so much to that. But one thing I've been researching and working on more recently is the idea of a feral transmedia story, one where it is entirely created in the experience and in the mind of the people who engage with a subject. And the pandemic is a really good example of that. For all of us, we take multiple stories from multiple sources and assemble them into our own particular understanding of what is happening in the world with this pandemic. And that's a fascination to me, because there are probably ways that can be manipulated for evil, and ways that mode of operating with a story can be manipulated for good. What that looks like, I don't know yet, but it'll be interesting exploring in the coming years to find that out. Okay,
so we can say that storytelling can be seen as a good evil, in a way.
But yes, perhaps, yes.
Anyway, if you want to add just something for before closing the really interesting conversation, because I'm really happy, so I don't know how to say.
I'm thrilled. This has been a lot of fun. But I think that for me, the biggest takeaway in the idea of rigor in design comes down to what I mentioned earlier, that idea that we need to struggle to prove ourselves wrong to know we are right in how we are creating the design. So we need to be aware of when we want something to happen. So as we look at the empathy research and the information we gather from our users, that we really listen to them, and we don't only hear what we want to hear.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kevin. I mean, I go away with a lot of new notes for my future research, and really thank you. And now probably it's time for us to leave the stage to the next host.